The first time I entered to show the cave, it was so powerful that every night I was dreaming of lions. And every day was the same shock for me. I mean, I'm a scientist, but a human too. And after 5 days, I decided not to go back in the cave because I needed time
to absorb it.
To absorb it, yeah.
It's said that Pablo Picasso, after visiting a Spanish cave filled with Paleolithic art, emerged from said cave shaking his head and declaring, "In 15,000 years we have invented nothing." Like most apocryphal stories, this likely never happened, but the quote lives on, preserved in part by the accuracy of the sentiment. We share his breathless amazement in the face of the brevity of human existence and its continued primitiveness. We see ourselves as lofty and advanced creatures when compared to our ancestors, but here we are, still carving our names into trees and etching crude vandalism on walls. Cave of Forgotten Dreams is a documentary that, since I first watched it years ago, stuck with me. It might not sound like a complex film by description. Werner Herzog enters the Chauvet cave in France with the rare opportunity to film the 30,000-year-old cave paintings inside. He interviews the scientists who study them. That's it. Over the course of the documentary, there are mysteries and questions without answers. There are long, brooding shots of images flickering under camera light. I can imagine a person dismissing the film as boring, as padded out with pointless speculation. But what Herzog brings, what he always seems to bring, is that flair of human spirit. The scientists he interviews are not stodgy lab coats droning on about facts and figures, but humans, bubbling over in excitement, imagination, and rapture. In the interior chamber of the cave, where paintings of lions and bison and horses gallop along the walls, the scientists can hardly speak for awe.
Sorry, silence please. Please don't move. We're going to listen to the silence in the cave, and perhaps we can even hear our own heartbeats.
In that moment, it isn't mere geology or anthropology. It is transcendence. What is art in the human consciousness? Where and when did art first arrive, along with music and language and symbolism and veneration? In the great evolutionary chain, all these human qualities arrived in one sudden rush, or at least closely together, as if some great superstructure connecting them all fell into place. Oh, there are debates, I'm sure, about what it all means, about what consciousness entails, about whether it's truly unique to us, how each of these aspects relates to the other. But today, I don't really want to talk about that. I want to talk about the body. More specifically, I want to talk about the implications that come from the realization that consciousness emerged from our physical bodies. Because however you define a mind, the fact is, the body came first. This film speaks to that mystery, that corporeal flesh and genes and rock and fire can collide together and create something that feels like spirit. That's important because in our era of rampant materialism, somehow paradoxically, we have become an antisomatic culture. We loathe our bodies. Part of this stems from a hyperconsumerism that sees our bodies as merchandise and property, or as an uncooperative system we have to bully into submission. We customize our bodies or go to war with them. Another part of this rests in our craving for a post-body future, the day when technology frees us from the bindings of our flesh, and we will exist as liberated neurons firing on metal plates, or as gray matter suspended in a silicon husk. In part, we have come to crave these endings because we think it is our bodies that hold us back from our dreams. If we can only escape these trappings, then we can rid ourselves of the senselessness of our biological bodies and live purely and unfettered. What if we're getting this wrong? What if it isn't our minds that ward off insanity? What if it's our bodies that give us dreams? What if our minds are unbridled peerings at reality that must be tempered and grounded by the sound dreams of our flesh? If that's true, what will be the consequences of severing the tie between the body and mind?
He sat and he started to touch up the paintings. So the ethnographer asked the question that every Western person would have asked, "Why are you painting?" And the man answered, I am not painting. That's the only hand spirit who is actually painting now.
The hand of a spirit.
Yeah, because the man is a part of the spirit.
A part of being a functional human is operating under certain assumptions, whether or not those assumptions are true. If I speak to someone one day, then meet them again the next, I operate under the assumption that this is the same person I spoke to before. In a purely materialist sense, I could make a compelling case that they aren't. Their cells are different. Their neurons have made new connections. Their hormones and chemical composition might be in a different state. But no human can function under that naked reality. If you treat a person as a stranger forever, then you cannot form bonds that are necessary for trust and cooperation. We must dream of a consistent person against the absolute reality of change. Some metaphysical assumptions are so entrenched that we can hardly conceive of the physical reality beneath them. For instance, human cultures have articulated the separation of body and mind. To divide ourselves in this way makes sense. After all, your body can act while the mind wanders, or your consciousness tells you to do one thing while your body does something else. We experience body and mind as two separate poles. We also experience our consciousness as transcendent from the body in ways that are seen in what some call spirit or soul. We interpret our minds as working apart and in some way floating above the biological space. It's a useful assumption. I even think most people would agree that human consciousness is more than the sum of its parts, but the parts aren't dispensable. The parts are integral. Consciousness is an emergent property and dependent on the arrangement of our physical bodies. In that way, we can say that body and mind are not separate at all. To demonstrate this paradox of composite unity, let's consider something you may have never thought about. Our brains are one in two. Our brains are divided into two hemispheres. Normally, these two hemispheres are bridged by a section of nerve tissue, the corpus callosum. But in some individuals, this bridge either never grew or they had it severed in a surgical procedure meant to treat life-threatening seizures. When this happens, the two hemispheres can't talk to each other. Though enough of the functions between the two hemispheres are redundant so as to make life possible, in fact, some people live with only one hemisphere of a brain, our brains are, to a significant extent, lateralized. That is, there are areas on one side of the brain that are dedicated to certain functions that may not have the same specialization on the other side. Split brain experiments revealed this in some mind-bending ways. Put an object in a blindfolded split brain patient's hand, and they can't name what they're holding until the object is placed in the other hand. Both sides of the brain can process the touch, but not both sides can equally recall words or use language. Sometimes it can even seem the two hemispheres disagree with each other. When the corpus callosum is intact, the hemispheres of our brain share and exchange information, even in cases where one side is specialized in a certain task. This crosstalk essentially allows for a useful illusion of unity. even though the hemispheres are physically two, and it seems experience the world quite differently. The two halves mutually recognize each other as a part of themselves. This is why the split-brain human doesn't become two people, even when the callosum is cut. The two halves will post hoc rationalize the other's actions as if the action was their own. It seems to be a contract agreed upon by every cell, every organ, every nerve in our body. Though in some sense each of these things are distinct, they cooperate to form a single being. At some point our brains had to adapt to our bodies being ours. It processes this in a number of ways. For one, there is structure in the brain dedicated to mapping our body parts. The brain uses proprioception to monitor where our body parts are. It uses physical feedback, it uses visual cues. However, even though your brain is literally inside your skull, both internal and external factors can screw up your brain's perception. If any of these functions are disrupted or manipulated, one can induce physical illusions such as the rubber hand experiment, or even out-of-body sensations. We see this fact lived out in different kinds of people. Some, for example, experience the strange, urgent belief that their body parts don't belong to them. And those who lose limbs due to accident or surgery often still feel fully maneuverable phantoms where the body parts once were. Given all of this, given that we are composite unified beings, dependent on our physical components to cooperate, mutually recognize each other, and exist as one, while at the same time usefully ascribing a transcendent quality over top the whole thing, mind over matter, we must ask ourselves some important questions. What are we? What makes us ourselves? And what happens when the mind-body connection goes wrong? The mind and body are unified. Our minds come from our bodies. Holding them separately in tension with one another is helpful, though. It helps us make decisions, think at a higher order, and temper the raw instincts and feedback from our bodies. But one can go to a damaging extreme. We can manipulate ourselves into feeling detached from our bodies, and this detachment, or so I'm arguing, has consequences. Has modernity severed this connection? Are the syndromes and dysmorphias and disruptions to our mind-body unity something of a symptom of a larger disease, a physiological bridge being burned? Modern life was built by the machinations of our minds. To ease the burden and therefore presence of our bodies, we have outsourced so much of our bodily care to specialists. The design of our homes to carpenters and craftsmen, the design of our diets to food corporations, the design of our healthcare to government entities, that we expend less energy toward their flourishing, and much more to the thrill of our ephemeral sensory experiences. As modern life becomes more comfortable, we tolerate less of our physicality. We are more plugged in, more disassociated, and it seems we are at battle with our bodies every day because of it. The brain at least has language nodes that allow it to speak, but the rest of the body only has a few means to communicate, and those means are increasingly dampened by our intolerance for its particular type of nervous chatter. Sometimes our protesting bodies malfunction in ways so subtle that we don't notice it until the trends emerge on a population scale. Consider for a moment the anorexic, who looks in the mirror and sees ugliness, who tries to fix it by starving and sneaking diet pills and exercising to the point of exhaustion until their organs shut down. Their particular self-loathing can feel far from ourselves if we've never personally experienced an eating disorder. But what is interesting is that anorexia is, for the most part, a disease of affluence. It mostly occurs in industrialized, modern countries. We might rightly point out that these cultures value thinness, and that such messages are communicated by the media in such ways that are, themselves, distorted, exaggerated, and manipulated in methods both surgical and digital. And this is why anorexia manifests the way that it does. But anorexia, its underlying psychology, is more than an obsession with thinness. It is about a brute force exertion of control away from the body and towards one's true self. It is a tightening of the reins, a grasp for a sense of control against the body's physical needs. Anorexics might express their hostility to their bodies more overtly, but the belief in the dominance of self and the subservience of the bodies is now something of a cultural pathology, and all of us are touched by it. I could talk about transgender medicalism here, but honestly, I don't even have to. Trans people are by far not the only ones toying with extreme body modification or venting online about their urgent, desperate desire to be released from the shape of their flesh. Cosmetic surgeries abound. Women, and now men too, go under the knife to transform into grotesque parodies of the human form in seeking some ideal. Some, driven by dysmorphia or addiction or sheer obsession, seek out surgeries to become non-human. More seek to outrun age, outrun being biological. Meanwhile, in recent years, the opioid epidemic has received a lot of attention, and with it, a national discussion about the way we approach and treat pain. This too seems connected to a sense of despair about physical life. We are so much less capable of enduring suffering, both physical and mental. It feels unfair that anyone should have to feel pain in a world with so many material delights. So not only do we drown ourselves in pain medication, but in antidepressants and mood stabilizers and illegal drugs and more upon more. We would rather not feel the pain rather than discover if the pain has root. If your body is trying to tell you something about your diet, your lifestyle, your relationships, your internal mythology, we sooner want an escape than a cure. A possible counter-argument could be that actually we live in an age of flesh worship. To back this up, one need only look at the sexual liberation and the fat positivity movements, both of which, apparently, suggest that fleshly pleasures are the highest value. Yet there is more going on here. I think what's really happening is a confusion of two things: the good of the flesh and the simple dopamine triggers of sensual acts. Dopamine brings a hit of pleasure to our brains and gives us the impression that something positive is happening. But increasingly, these dopamine hits are divorced from the purpose of the physical acts. The wave of stimulation used to be the surface-level drive to deeper drives. The pleasure of eating food nourished us, and the pleasure of sex propagated our species. But now we have elevated the surface level and ignored the deep. We want the medal without running the race, and technological progress has enabled this practice. Neither the sex nor fat positivity movement is really about loving one's body. It is a love of pleasure and a disdain for the limitations of our bodies to provide it. We hold resentment against the flesh for swelling up when we gorge ourselves on food and sex, as if our bodies are overly strict parents that force us to live out the consequences of our libertine, licentious choices. For the fat activist, rebellion comes in the form of denial, and for the sex activist, it comes in the form of induced chemical imbalances, invasive surgeries, and the disassembling of pregnancy from start to finish. Both have traded in the natural equilibrium of their bodies for the non-stop, empty waves of analgesia and euphoria. Keep lazing on the couch. Keep pushing junk food in your face. Keep scrolling. Keep fucking. And when your body revolts, by following its nature, suppress it. Ignore it. Punish it. We are not worshiping flesh. We are crucifying it. When I first noticed this impulse, I wondered if this wasn't some rediscovered form of Gnosticism, the belief in the corrupted nature of the material and a quest for the secret metaphysical good, the elevation of the mind's importance in that we sacrifice our bodies to flood our brains with excess stimuli, feels like a dedication to a supernatural plane. One of the first things that a cult does to disrupt the sense of individual self in their followers is to establish a strict separation between their bodies and spirit. Bodies are called vessels, shells, containers ready to be disposed of when their higher calling demands it. But perhaps it's not Gnosticism at all. Perhaps it's a distorted result of our hyper-materialist mindset. If everything is mere material, then we ought to be able to alter, shape, and rearrange it to our liking. Our bodies are not us, but empty shells, so nothing is lost in the process. We've come to think of only our brain as the person and the rest of the body as inconvenient stuff. When we don't think of our bodies as sacred, we think of them as products.
君にはもう肉体なんていらないんだよ、レイ。
そんなの嘘だ。
When the internet was born, a lot of theories emerged about its impact on societal life. From the era of bulletin board systems, some saw anonymity and collaboration across generational, class, gender, and ethnic lines as a sign of a promising post-identity future. In some sense, there were those who saw this budding new form of communication as the perfect experiment for the breaking of boundaries. No one knows you're a dog on the internet. And the internet has done something, we're just not fully sure what yet. One theory that has failed is the internet's promise of the true self, as if by contributing to an uninterrupted, constant feed of social tidbits, posts, tweets, photos, shares, we are, through that process, refining our views of each other. In the physical realm, interactions are clumsy, incomplete, and inhibited by shyness or social convention, but on the internet, we are more free to say what we want, and less prone to hold back. This would especially seem true of those who interact online under a persona. If no one knows who you really are, then you can choose the avatar that speaks to you more truly than your face ever could. You choose your name, your appearance. You present yourself in a way that feels more honest. However, what we have gotten used to in social media is a type of disingenuity. When we interact with people face to face, a lot of information is passively communicated without our knowing or meaning it. But in the hyper-curated, calculated world of online identity, we get to select what to show, delete what we regret, and overall create the picture we want. There are Instagram influencers and Second Life players who take this to the extreme, but we all, to some extent, do it. Because posting and streaming are not passive. We must choose to type or to turn on our camera. You don't accidentally run into someone online, bump shoulders, and exchange awkward small talk. In fact, unless you choose to say something, you can stay invisible and enjoy interactions as a silent party. In real life, we would find such lurking to be creepy and voyeuristic, but online, it's an accepted and unavoidable practice. This segmentation has crept into other dimensions of life. Dating and sex are increasingly squeezed into swipes and profiles, body parts suspended in a square of pixels. Pornography has fast become the main and sometimes only expression of sensual desire. And more young women than ever are online selling access to their body parts as a subscription service. Nothing is personal. All is atomized and delivered in fleshly chunks and digital bytes. The consequences here have been staggering. Skyrocketing rates of depression and loneliness, more young people with no sexual experiences, fewer friends, fewer marriages, more addiction. As our bodies shrink, so does the pleasure and stability they can offer. We are not whole anymore. Once we lost the grounding of our corporeal bodies, it is hardly surprising that teenagers online are identifying as fairykin, falling in love with cartoon ponies, trying to summon the spirits of video game characters, or diagnosing themselves as disassociative and finding that they are systems hosting dozens of alternate personalities. It's not surprising that as young people less often experience physical intimacy, that their online appetite for explicit, bizarre, taboo-laden porn grows. Disembodied, our conscious fantasies run amok.
Well, I guess cyborgs like myself have a tendency to be paranoid about our origins. Sometimes I suspect I'm not who I think I am, like maybe I died a long time ago and somebody took my brain and stuck it in this body. Maybe there never was a real me in the first place, and I'm completely synthetic like that thing.
Futurists have long predicted the possibility of becoming machines. For some, this means living as an uploaded digital consciousness within a machine. For others, this means full physical integration between our biological brains and robot bodies. At this point, you shouldn't be surprised that I am in part skeptical, but even more strongly opposed to such moves. This all may seem far off yet. Indeed, I don't think I'm going to live to see such a future realized, and I even doubt the kind of robot body integration seen in science fiction is going to be reached in the next century. But technology develops at a blinding pace, and I'm not an expert in these fields, so for all I know, this is closer than I or anyone realizes. Still, my practical doubts lie in a few areas. The first, the idea that a human consciousness can be uploaded to a data drive, bodiless, simply programmed into a terminal. Not only would this process be, depending how it's done, merely the process of cloning and not transference, but how could we justify creating a human consciousness and shoving them into a space where they have no body and no agency? Well, program them to feel as if they have a body, one might argue. But how convincingly will we be able to do that? Our brains interpret body ownership through agency. With what dimensional space will they be able to express it? And even once we simulate a real enough body in a real enough digital world, will the accuracy of both of these elements overcome an uncanny valley, a deep sense of wrongness? I see two possibilities here. Either we will have to dismember the human consciousness enough to make it tolerate such conditions and therefore make the consciousness not really human anymore, or watch such beings experience an unspeakable kind of hell. More in reach is the cyborg fate. Human physiology, fully augmented, maybe even replaced with mechanical bodies. It does seem that we have the technological capability to hack our brain's sense of body ownership, and so potentially could use these techniques to transplant a brain into a robot body, and with a little mechanical know-how get the brain to operate said body. This is no longer an insane proposition. For Pete's sake, they've done this with rat brains already, though to be clear, said rat brains didn't survive very long. We have human cyborgs with brain-operated prosthetics. Plausibly, we could see a complete physical transference of a human brain into a robot system someday in the distant future. But my additional feelings of doubt rest in the ethics and ontology of such humanized machines, because that is what I think they will be, machines, grafted with human elements, but not really human beings anymore. When I hear speculation about, say, the someday ability to hop around freely between mechanized bodies, be male one day, female the next, something customized the next, I think how cool that would be, but also how problematic. If we could swap bodies as easily as we adopt avatars online, the societal problems would be astronomical. In such a society, would we ever really let go of a sense of reality? No matter how the masculine purple anthro-wolf in front of you insists its form is its true self, will we ever be able to stop wondering who they really were? How could anyone hope to make ethical decisions if our bodies could be swapped at any moment? In fact, what would be the point of any sexual ethics at all? What would marriage mean? And what would the sexual act mean? What would ownership mean? This is the biggest hurdle that I don't know can be overcome by the transhuman dream. Once our consciousness is uploaded to some server or our brains transplanted into advanced cyborg bodies, who owns our bodies? In the controversial science fiction short story, I Sexually Identify as an Attack Helicopter, the trans author imagines a surreal future in which the military has discovered the technology to hack gender, thereby allowing the human female narrator to transform her identity into a helicopter. No longer human, much less female, she roams the desert edges of an apocalyptic United States, callously blowing up buildings full of civilians and describing the erotic, somatic experience of her steel skin and radar sense. The story was doomed to be misinterpreted, and it was criminally so. But one sound reading is the questioning of how our bodies can become subsumed in a system that craves capital and political power. The narrator's body is no longer her own. Indeed, her identity and self are no longer her own, but a weapon, owned, maintained, and controlled by the military complex. Even as the story twists in unreal ways with the lines blurring between flesh and machine and sex, there is an underlying dread already poking through our current reality that modernity threatens to swallow up our bodies, ourselves, in ruthless utility. Every time we declare ourselves free from natural law, corporations step in to advertise new, sparkling chains in a delectable range of colors and prices. It used to be believed that God gave us our bodies, Whether you believe in God or not, at least I hope you can agree that there is something comforting about having a natural body that no one can own, which is ours to give and no one else's, and that there is something perverse about occupying a body licensed and owned by a corporation.
It is like you are creating the phone directory of Manhattan, 4 million precise entries, but do they dream? Do they cry at night? What are their hopes? What are their families? You will never know from the phone directory.
Definitely, we will never know.
What does a cave tell us about dreams? An interesting characteristic of some of the paintings on cave walls is that they were drawn along the shapes of the rock, as if the animal were being observed and discovered, spirits budding out from shadow. So are the paintings of bison products of human cognition, or the touch of inked hands, or the contours and fractures embedded in the walls? Or were they inseparably a product of Trinity, a composite of the things that make us human? In fact, why paint in caves at all? Were caves the precursors to the temple? Did ancient civilizations remember the chambers, the tall maw of ceilings, the limestone columns, the deep and secret spaces, and use those memories in their shaping of sacred temples? There's an intuitive understanding exhibited by even the earliest of humans that the shape, texture, material, and canvas are necessary for the metaphorical to come to life. It is only when the temple is shaped just so and with just these kinds of stones in this order that spirit can come to dwell. Meaning cannot be separated from the material. Change the material and you will change the meaning. If my body is a temple, a physical material that facilitates and culminates in me, then how should I think about it? How should I care for it? Augment its walls, tend to it in its lifelong, steady decay? Should I allow gentle touch-ups, repair a broken window or two, or should I bulldoze the whole thing and build a Walmart over top? Whatever I do, my decisions will have consequences beyond the aesthetic. A story came to mind as I was writing this of a young Sikh woman standing in line when a stranger snapped a picture of her and posted it to Reddit. Why? Because she had a beard. Online mockery and rudeness followed, but she was able to post on the thread and gracefully respond with an explanation. She was born with the condition that caused the beard, but her faith dictated that she respect her body as it was given to her by God. This is a peculiar position to hold in our culture. How trivial it seems. What's the big deal about shaving a little excess body hair? But in many cultures outside our own, we see evidence of this belief that what we do to our bodies is not trivial, but deadly serious. Whether it's tattoos, piercings, sacred scars, veils, or taboos against eating certain things, touching the unclean, or being in the presence of the cursed. The modern West has abandoned much of this thinking as needless superstition, but throwing it all out has left us bereft of the nobility and strength those beliefs offered. We do so much thoughtlessly now. We treat our bodies cheaply. I cannot and won't say that shaving is a sin, nor is being online, getting cosmetic surgery, or taking anxiety medication. But I wish all of us, myself included, thought more carefully about the implications of our attitudes in all of these actions. There are times when it is our mindset, not our behavior, that is truly the problem, and I wonder if we were more respectful to our bodies, spent less time agonizing over, controlling, and ignoring them, and spent more time integrating with them, moving, and touching, and painting, and yes, suffering, if we would find ourselves more whole. Some of what I've said here is grounded in today, in critique of our digital age. I've also spoken to attitudes about our future. I don't expect people to agree with all my thinking. I imagine some people are more hopeful about the promises of transhumanism, and others will be less amenable to my suggestion that our bodies are us. That's okay. Even if you don't accept certain claims, perhaps you can still find something to weigh and consider. Anyway, like all times I write down my thoughts, I don't really do it to persuade anyone, though when I post them, I enjoy seeing comments that demonstrate how others are thinking on similar issues. This essay, though, was written for me. To me. At the end of January this year, I went to the emergency room after experiencing hours of agonizing, unexplainable pain. They told me nothing was wrong with me. I would return to the emergency room again later that week, and then to my primary care doctor, then to a specialist, then to a neurologist, and meanwhile, weeks and months passed by, and the pain never stopped. Sometimes it evolved until I found myself lying down, fiery pain shooting through my legs and arms and back and face, and no one could tell me what was wrong. But while all this was going on, back to that January, about a week after my pain had started, I found out my dad also went to the emergency room. By February, we were informed that he had a rare form of cancer in his abdomen, that the tumor had grown so large and was placed so precariously that the initial team told him they could not surgically remove it. He was able to get a second opinion. He was able to find a team willing to remove it, and the removal went well. But for about a week, my family lived with the belief that we may have come to the end of a road. This year should have convinced me that bodies are a curse. Our bodies are indeed flawed, broken, defective, and self-destructive. Some days I wanted to crawl out of my body just to feel normal, and I can't imagine what my dad felt. But humanness is a package deal. We inherited the dreams and pictures and also the pain. I'm not deluded about the dysfunction and trauma our bodies carry with us. Our bodies break down and over time prevent us from pursuing the things we want. For some with physical disabilities, it might even feel laughable to think of the body as anything but a problem to be fixed. To make life tolerable, it is sometimes wise, necessary even, to reap the benefits of our modern era by using the tools it has given us. Neither am I a Luddite who thinks all technology needs to be thrown out. We're still figuring out how to interact in a connected world, and I'm not so cynical as to overlook its positive impacts, or to suppose humans cannot adapt to this new digital landscape. Adaptation is what we do best, and once upon a time, language, tool-making, and music were new technologies in themselves. But I suggest moving forward as we learn new things and develop new technologies, that we do so without forgetting or diminishing where we were born. In dark, visceral forests, with hands and feet, song and dance, story and craft.
It was Homo sapiens, and it's still called Homo sapiens, the man who knows. I don't think it's a good definition at all. We don't know much. I would think Homo spiritualis